James Bond, the character and series that is basically responsible for the entire secret agent genre, let alone his own franchise of movies, books, and of course, video games. It's a series that has influenced and entertains generations for over 60 years, and while the movies themselves are influential in their own way, in the 90s, it was a video game entry that trailblazed the genre in its own way. Welcome back to Replay Value, the show where we look at old games and see if they're still fun. And man, I am so excited to be reviving this series. The first 5 episodes I did of this were some of the most fun I've ever had creating anything. So after some time off from everything, it just feels amazing to kind of be getting back into it and really just continuing to expand on this really fun idea I had last year. Now, before we get too deep into it, there are some slight changes moving forward. The format of the show has changed just a little bit, still the same general premise, same general tone and all that, but I did realize after looking back at it and taking some time that the format was just a little too close to some of my main influences on this channel. So I took some tweaks and just kind of switched things up a little bit to make it a little bit more me. That being said, after this is over, please feel free to let me know how you like the changes, if there's anything else you'd like to see, all that stuff, yada, yada, yada. Let's go ahead and get into Goldeneye for the N64. The mid to late 90s in games was widely a transition for taking all kinds of genres into the 3D landscape. First-person shooters were definitely no exception. Doom had broken down every wall imaginable earlier in the decade, and some games like Duke Nukem 3D started to take steps in this new era, but nothing quite revolutionized the genre again until 1997, when Goldeneye for the Nintendo 64 was released. Not only was this game a shooter, but it added in a number of different ripples that we hadn't seen before. Missions now had objectives, stealth was a theme in several levels, and gadgets were introduced. Suddenly, FPSs were different. Gone were the days of every level being run and gun, and in came a dynamic experience that was miles more immersive than anything we've seen before. I think one of the biggest benefits of this, it may be kind of obvious now, but was huge at the time, is just the fact that you can tackle every mission in a different way. You can go back and play this game, and no two playthroughs will be identical if you don't want them to be. Certain missions that are normally on the stealthy side, you can try blazing your way through, while others that were more enemy heavy, you can try sneaking through to make things a little bit easier if you had a hard time before. And that's something that we kind of expect to be normal now, but it was really implemented with this game. As far as the game itself, you play as James Bond, loosely following the plot of the movie, which came out 2 years prior. The first 3 missions follow the prologue from the movie, while the following missions branch off into more prologue-based content of their own, before later joining back in with the movie while adding in certain parts that weren't included before, but mostly hitting the same impact moments from the movie. And funny enough, if you had been around in the 90s, whether you were growing up or you were already adult and you were playing this game back then when it came out, none of what I mentioned is probably what you remember the game for. Most likely, myself included, most of your time was spent playing the multiplayer. Now, unfortunately, with the way that I played this game and recorded everything, there wasn't really a way that I could do the multiplayer that would do it justice. But the thing is that it is something that is too legendary to not go without mention. So before even going too much into my playthrough and what I like and what I didn't like of this game, I mean, it is worth noting that the multiplayer in Goldeneye is revolutionary. We don't have things like Halo or even Counter-Strike or any of the shooters that we have now, Call of Duty, any of it, without the multiplayer from this game. There was something just special about in the late 90s, going over to your friend's house, you guys having a little bit of an argument or whatever, and then you settle the score by loading up Temple and just see who's better. It's something that I want to mention, because no matter how I score this game moving forward, if you have an opportunity to boot this game up and play it multiplayer with some friends, split screen the old school way, 100 times over, do it every time, because that is, in its own independent thing, worth binging a million times over, no matter how I score the rest of this game moving forward. So just keep in mind, my score is not talking about multiplayer. That is special. That said, let's just go ahead and move on. I've already mentioned the openness in regards to how you can play each mission, but there really is something to be said about how much it adds to a playthrough all of these years later. There's something about going through a mission that doesn't need to be stealthy, but sneaking around as much as possible to get around some of the bigger pools of enemies in a tougher level. Plus, my favorite feature that basically became a trend with this game was adding objectives the higher in difficulty you went up. You could start this game on the lowest difficulty and go up to the next one, and it wasn't just the frequency and the strength of the enemies that got got tougher, but more wrinkles were added to the level, more objectives, areas that you didn't see on your previous playthrough. It really felt like every single time that you got better at this game, more and more of these levels opened up and you saw things you didn't see before. This is something that has been perfected and expanded over the years and is really one of my favorite gaming trends to come out of this title. On a similar note, the variety and different types of missions in this game still holds up to this day, and it keeps things interesting, which is great when reviewing this game because other games I've gone over... Speaking of things I don't like, look, I love the N64. It's my second or third favorite console of all time. I will always appreciate what it did for my childhood, what it did for me and my life in general. This thing, though, this controller on certain games fills me with so much rage, confusion, and an unhealthy amount of questioning my life decisions. Moving around is fine, and thankfully there's some auto-aim, but only having one stick will always make this controller janky. That and the stick sensitivity when you're trying to use the aim trigger is enraging to say the least. It honestly makes me respect anyone who speedruns games like this or Perfect Dark, because at least from my experience, any precision I have in other games goes flying out the window here. Also, I can't let the AI go unmentioned. It is bad. The amount of weird shit that enemies and NPCs in this game do is astounding. And there's plenty of ways this shows itself. Whether it's hostages making their situation worse, or enemies putting you and themselves in harm's way by not knowing which scenery explodes, which will either harm you or softlock you from progressing in some levels. Hell, the final boss stopped and confronted me early, which kind of robbed me of the typical ending. But then there's the absolute most foul occurrence, Natalia. My utter disdain for escort missions is well on the record at this point, but not even that could prepare me for some of the moments this game would provide. Natalia's AI, no matter what difficulty, what mission, what task, no matter what, has no idea what is happening around her at any given moment ever. It's almost impressive, really, at least in how consistently bad it is. The amount of times that she will just run off or stop following is off the charts. It's one thing if she were to just get in the way of fire and that was the main issue, but then you throw in that running I mentioned and it's a disaster every time. And it's unknown what sets her off. Sometimes she just goes off on some Forrest Gump shit. Lastly, there's two things that I do want to bring up that may not ruin it for everybody, but it did kind of affect me in this playthrough, so it's worth noting. First, on a similar note to something we mentioned earlier, it is worth mentioning that if you're playing this game solo, you are losing out on the best part of the game, most likely. That may not bug everybody, and it's not like gonna absolutely damn this game, but it did lead to points of emptiness because, again, knowing that there is something much better this game has to offer and not being able to play that if you're going the solo route, it did kind of leave a little bit of a sour taste here and there, but I'm not gonna crucify the game for that. And second, as nitpicky as this may sound, I'm not gonna compare this game to modern games because, well, for obvious reasons, but there is a similar game made by the same devs that came out very shortly after, and of course that is Perfect Dark. Now, the reason I bring that up is because Perfect Dark is still one of my favorite video games of all time. It's something that I actually boot up and play on the regular still. The reason I mention that is because for me, I'm so used to playing basically the virtual successor to this game that is an improvement in pretty much every single way. So when you go back, you do kind of have to take off the goggles of like, okay, there's some things that weren't worked out yet. So it's not going to hurt the game too much like the first thing. But again, it is something that I felt during my playthrough, so it had to be at least mentioned. But with all that in mind, let's go ahead and wrap this up and just go over how I feel about everything all together. Goldeneye still definitely has its fun moments, and it's a classic for a reason. The semi-sandbox nature of this game offers a ton of replayability, and it will always be fun going back and playing this through the different difficulties and the different challenges it has to offer. I wouldn't binge this game like others that I have reviewed in this series so far, but I will say that it is worth revisiting. It's a fun game in doses that offers a good challenge in parts and, you know, some damn good nostalgia. As always, thank you guys so much for checking this episode out. It feels amazing bringing this series back after a year away. Of course, let me know if you like the new format, any other changes you'd like to see, And of course, if there's a game you want to see me review in the future, let me know down below. Like, subscribe, all the stuff that people typically peddle on here, and I will see you next time.